We're now on to chapter 10, 11, and 12. At the end of chapter 9, Heathcliff had left. Catherine had married Edgar. And at the very end of chapter 10, when we're back in the present of 1801, Lockwood has to convalesce for about 4 weeks because he's still so ill. When we start back in chapter 10, we are moving on 3 years later. Ironically, of course, at the beginning of chapter 10, in the present, Heathcliff himself comes and visits Lockwood because he has been ill. And of course, we know that Lockwood has been listening to stories about his past. Of course, Heathcliff has no idea. In chapter 10, Heathcliff returns after his 3 years' absence. So, read this whole interaction. How is he changed? Who is he compared to and in what way? What remains unchanged about Heathcliff? What's also interesting is, in a certain sense, it seems that he changes his mind about certain steps he's going to take based on Kathy's reaction to him. Look for that in the text as well. And again, look at this passage in your text in chapter 10 when we have a description of Heathcliff, because he has changed, but how much? Is it only external? And remember why Kathy chose Edgar over Heathcliff in chapter 9. Now, Heathcliff is not staying in Gimmerton in the village. He's actually staying back at Wuthering Heights, where Henley, who hates him, lives. And this is perplexing to Nellie. She's wondering why Earnshaw, Henley, has invited Heathcliff to stay. What is going on? This little reference to mischief under a cloak, that's an allusion to the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, this idea that someone can smile and look all nice and wonderful, but all the while under the cover of the darkness of a cloak be up to no good. So what is Nellie feeling about Heathcliff staying at Wuthering Heights? We get introduced to Isabel in much more detail in chapter 10. So what is Isabella like? Is she similar to Catherine, different, both on how she looks and how she acts? What is Catherine's description of Heathcliff to Isabella? How does it differ or similar to Nellie's description of Heathcliff? Has Heathcliff changed? Has he stayed the same? What is Isabella's interest in Heathcliff? There are a lot of animal imagery brought up and a lot of animals connected to Isabella. What connotations would they have? Is Isabella being described as an animal? Are other people being described as an animal? Take a look and see what the connection is. What does Catherine mean in her argument with Isabella that Heathcliff has a growing avarice? What does Catherine mean when she talks to Heathcliff and says, that a dozen nephews shall erase Isabella's title? What is she suggesting? What's going on in regards to Heathcliff and Isabella and Catherine and Isabella and all three of them? And is Nellie going to be a factor in this as well? In chapter 11, we get a focus actually of Nellie on herself, on Wuthering Heights, and feelings, memories she has about Henley. So what does she remember? What does that suggest about their relationship? What drives Nellie to go back to Wuthering Heights? Who does she see there? Who does she not see? And how is that significant? I think we get to see a little bit more of what drives Nellie and maybe a little bit of her own feelings. So do pay attention to that. We have a scene with Isabella in the courtyard feeding pigeons. Again, pigeons have a connotation with homes, with nesting, with security. Frequently they're in a flock. Also, pigeons have a biblical allusion. They were often used for sacrifice. Do any of these elements connect with Isabella feeding the pigeons when she interacts with Heathcliff? We don't hear this interaction. We know that Nellie sees it from the window. Again, we have windows. What is Nellie's response to seeing Heathcliff and Isabella's interaction? What is Catherine's response? Once Nellie tells Edgar about the interaction, how does he respond? What ultimately does that lead to? And examine the text on 97 and 98. There's a whole declaration that Heathcliff makes to Catherine, and she seems surprised by it and gets quite upset. And then think about what Heathcliff says. What is he talking about? Revenge He's not seeking it against Catherine, but he's seeking it maybe, in some sense, because of Catherine. What does he mean that the tyrant grinds down his slaves and they don't turn against him? They crush those beneath them. What's going on here? Ultimately, we have the scene in chapter 11 with the fight. What happens with the key? Where is it thrown? Why is that significant? What does Catherine talk about when she's talking about Edgar, and actually talking about Edgar to himself? She compares him to a suckling leveret, a baby rabbit, who is described as cold. What are the references of cold and heat in this chapter and in this novel? How do they interact? What role does Nellie play in all this? Is she objective? Does she have her own axe to grind? Does she stir the pot at all? Take a look at Nellie and examine what she does and what she says and how that has an impact on the other characters. Also think about how Heathcliff has had an impact on all the other characters in chapters 10 and 11. What interaction, control, effect has he had on Catherine and Isabella and Edgar and Hareton? Look back in 11. Hareton talks a little bit about Heathcliff, and he talks about his own father. So, at the end of chapter 11, what does Edgar ultimately demand? What is Catherine's response to this demand? Really examine the visual description of how she responds. Now, in chapter 12, I want you to look for the references to books and windows. Are windows open or closed? If they are open, who closes them? Who is paying attention to their books instead of paying attention to other people? Do look for this. And of course, we have a dog barking in the background, and no dog right here in this chapter. Well, actually we do. We have a dog at the very end of the chapter. Be on the lookout for that. So, when Edgar reacts to Catherine and Isabella's behavior, does this show him as a cold person or simply a rational person? What do you think and why? Catherine has a whole sense of delirium as she's ill. What has made her ill? What is she thinking while she is in this state of delirium? How does that connect with her relationship with Heathcliff, her childhood, her own identity, any and all of these things? Nellie dismisses a lot of what Catherine says in this delirium when she's talking to Lockwood. Is she right to do so? What is Bronte conveying about what Catherine really thinks that maybe Nellie herself is not picking up on or doesn't want to pick up on for some reason? Is Nellie Catherine's hidden enemy, as Catherine says in her delirium? Does Nellie lie in this chapter? We have maybe lies of commission, lies of omission, and then there is information at the end of the chapter that she holds back. Why does she hold it back? And ultimately, what has Isabella done? We do have a dog at the end of this chapter. What condition does Nellie find that dog in? And what does this tell us about Isabella and what has happened? I hope you enjoy chapters 10, 11, and 12, and I really look forward to discussing them with you.